Yes, hello. Good afternoon from London, and I hope you're all having a good day. My name is Anthony Froggatt, and I'm a senior research fellow here at Chatham House. Thank you so much for joining us in this webinar on the energy transition and the securitization of materials and supply chains. This is a third webinar in a four-part series, which we've been running looking at the different elements of the energy transition and elements that we think have been under discussed. The first of these took place in February, and there we looked at issues around the energy transition and its impact on sort of the non-fossil fuel or the non-fuel elements of fossil fuels, so things like plastics, fertilizers, etc. Then the one in last month looked at some of the financial questions around the energy transition and the implications for the global financial system. And then today, what we wanted to discuss with you all was, the question about securitization of materials and supply chains. And just before we crack on with that, just wanted to highlight that the final one in the series will take place on the 16th of May. So that's Thursday, the 16th of May, at the same time. So sort of 1 o'clock UK time. And we will do that as a hybrid meeting. So if people are in London and would like to come and join us in person, we can offer you a lunch, sandwich lunch. It would be lovely. And we thought that would be a great networking opportunity, give added value for people to spend their travel time, as we've been discussing beforehand. And yeah, hopefully people would be able to join us. Just let myself or Raquel know if you'd like to join that. I'd just like to say that this whole series has been great, and it's been sponsored by AIG Finance and Insurance Group, and with their really grateful for their support to enable us to put this on. We want to make this session as interactive as possible. So please do, if you've got questions, you want to put them in the chat, or if you feel you prefer to do that, then just raise your hand, and then when we come into the open parts of the session, then we can unmute you, and you're welcome to put your question or your point. It doesn't have to be questions in person. So how we're going to run this is, if I just say a few remarks, then I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll give them a 5 to 7 minutes sort of introduction. We'll then have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then welcome your engagement within the question. So we've got an hour and a half. Sort of each of those is half an hour-ish. So there's plenty of time for your engagement. So please do feel free to join us in the discussion. So just in terms of why we wanted to do this, I mean, I guess as we're all too aware, what we've seen over the last couple of years, and in particular following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, was a significant shift within the energy sector. And Russia, obviously, as sort of the world's or one of the world's largest energy producers, that affected the market globally, but in particular, it impacted upon Europe, where it was the major supplier. But I think I'd argue that its impact globally was both in terms of the market, and we saw higher prices of energy across the world, but also a shift in terms of policies. And then we saw a movement, or in some ways a swing away from climate change or environment being top of the concern to being issues around affordability and security of supply, raising up the policy agenda. And I think what that led to was increased calls for, in some cases, a reinvestment in different forms of fossil fuels, or a diversification of fossil fuels away from Russia, or just in general having a diverse supply of fossil fuels. But also in some cases, and in particular, I think we'd look to Europe, but clearly in other parts of the world as well, an acceleration of the energy transition and the desire to actually move away from fossil fuels from a supply and demand perspective. However, while we had that overarching narrative, there was also concern about China and the increasing or the significant role that it played within certain supply chains, so electric vehicles or solar. And there was one of the slogans that people talked about is, we don't want to get out of bed with Moscow and get into bed with Beijing. And it's overly simplified, but I think it was something that was a narrative that was used. Um, I think part of the response to the invasion, but in actual fact was we saw this before, was the energy transition not just being about climate change, but being about job creation. And I think in particular, we saw that in terms of President Biden in the United States with his whenever he thinks about climate change, he thinks about jobs. And that led to the whole Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that was in some ways, it was supported by the previous sort of slogan in terms of let's not be too reliant on China. So you saw that movement around the energy becoming a key part of industrial strategy, and the sort of within the UK term, it's the sort of the levelling up agenda. And then, as I said, the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then that led to responses in different parts of the world. The EU, the Critical Materials Strategy. In Japan, you had the Green Transformation Act, and others in South Korea, etc. So you saw the replicating of the Inflation Reduction Act, the desire to have increased security of supply for critical materials, and people were calling this, in some ways, a clean energy technology arms race. So we saw a major shift within the energy sector and the way that people were thinking about renewables in that regard. So I've thrown out three slogans, very high level, and I think I know that our panel today have a much greater understanding of this fascinating and complex issue. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, what we wanted to do was run through our three speakers. So we'll start with Fiona Clouder, who is a senior advisor to Applin Capital Advisory, which is a leading investor in the metals and mining and infrastructure sector. And she's also an independent director of the Chilean Cobalt Corporation. Before that, Fiona had wide experience in Latin America, both as a senior diplomat, being the UK ambassador to Chile from 2014 to 2018, but then also a regional ambassador and one of the key ambassadors for COP26. So she really brings a huge and important range of experience for this conversation. And then we have Tess van der Graaf, who is Associate Professor of International Politics at the Ghent Institute for International and European Studies, where he's an Associate Professor and coordinates the Ghent Institution for International and European Studies. From my perspective, one of the most important things about his involvement today is that he's the lead author of 3 reports on the geopolitics of the energy transition, which have been published by the International Renewable Energy Agency. So a huge wealth of experience on the energy transition and its global implications. And finally, but by no means least, we have Sebastian Dunnett, who's a senior program officer for natural economy at UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center. He's a natural scientist and working on the interface between science, policy, and practice to help tackle the global nature crisis. Has lots of experience in terms of some of the mining sectors and the issues around critical materials, science, and the engagement with the environment. So as I mentioned at the beginning, what we've asked is our 3 speakers give sort of 5 to 7 minutes introduction in that order. We'll then have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll hand it over to you all in the audience. So Fiona, welcome. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you to Chatham House, our sponsors, and indeed my fellow panelists. It's a great pleasure to take part in this discussion on what I think is really the issue of the moment, and indeed the issue of the future. And really, I have 3 things that I want to talk about, which is about the disconnects on this agenda, the fact we're very late on this agenda, and the tremendous opportunity for the future. So why are there all these disconnects? As Anthony said, I was involved in COP26, and let's just go back and remind ourselves why this is important in relation to what we're talking about today in terms of critical mineral supply chains. So at that conference in November 21 in Glasgow, the world did move, not enough, not fast enough, and not enough has been done, but it did move to those commitments for net zero for 2050. But that actually means you need radical action to reduce emissions by 2030. And there were what were called the Glasgow breakthroughs, which identified the 5 top sectors in which progress needed to be made, which were about clean power, which were about road transport, particularly zero-emission vehicles, which were about steel and near zero-emission steel production, about hydrogen as affordable, renewable, low-carbon source of energy, and about climate-smart, sustainable agriculture. So these are all very worthy ambitions, and then of course there are a whole load of other commitments in Glasgow, and they've been built on in the subsequent COPs. But coming from this world of environmental policymaking, what really struck me was the disconnect between the energy world and then the mining world. And fundamentally, to meet those commitments for 2030, we need to go 5 times faster than we are now in reducing emissions. And so there's a real disconnect between that aspiration and the reality that it's not just about political will for that energy transition, it's the materials, the minerals you need to make that happen. And roughly speaking, if we're going to go 5 times faster, you need 5 times more stuff to make that happen. And then a further disconnect we have, and as Anthony has outlined in his introduction, is of course big geopolitics also intervene on this agenda, and not least Russia, Ukraine, and other developments in the world. And so you also now have this disconnect, perhaps between countries very focused on energy security versus this aspiration for the energy transition. And so also has been outlined, you have countries think much more conscious of their energy sources and the materials that are needed simply to keep the world going as we know it, never mind address what we need to do for climate change, the energy transition, etc. And so you've seen countries all over the world start to develop these critical mineral strategies. I think there's something like 35, probably more different ones, perhaps our expert colleagues can tell us more. And they differ between the different countries as to who thinks what is critical. For a long time, for example, copper was not seen as critical, simply seen as a base metal. But again, if you look at the sheer volumes of supply that are needed, countries are now recognizing that too other base metals are critical, as well as the materials that are needed for the energy transition. Obviously, everyone thinks about lithium batteries, etc. We'll talk more about that. A further disconnect is the volume of supply and the scale up that is needed and the time frame in which that is needed. So not only are vast multiples of many of these materials needed, many of them are located in countries that themselves are not perhaps politically or economically stable. Many are in countries that themselves are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But the sheer volumes that are needed, it's about how do you scale that up? And again, you have this disconnect between the aspiration versus the reality of what the industry can deliver. And analysis has shown, I believe, that actually there are sufficient minerals somewhere in the world to meet the overall global demand, but whether that can be secured fast enough and who secures it is an interesting geopolitical competition. And then mining takes a long time. From discovering a new asset to actually making a mine productive can take something like 16 years. We haven't got 16 years. A big part of that is very rightly around the environmental permitting, community consultation. So another disconnect is how do you ensure and maintain the rigor of those very, very important standards, but how do you also accelerate this process so that the industry can actually deliver what the world urgently needs? So you have a disconnect of pace. You also have a disconnect of finance in terms of the billions of dollars that are needed to make this happen. Some investors think this is just another commodity super cycle and it will sort itself out, without perhaps realizing this is a paradigm shift never seen before in terms of what the world needs for the energy transition. And so to finance that, to make that happen again in time, is another big challenge. And you also have disconnects in levels of the industry. You have the majors, the big players in the mining industry, the big names we all know, like the Anglo-Americans, Antofagastas, BHPs, Rio Tinto, etc., of this world, who of course play an absolutely vital role in this. But the degree of extraction required, the difficulty of extraction, the new sources that are required, means what are called the junior miners are also very, very important. And that's a sector that is facing big challenges in securing finance, and yet is vitally needed in terms of the capacity, skills, materials to deliver on this agenda. And then another disconnect is around skills and capacity both at the policy making level and crucially at the policy implementation level, but also the range of skills that is needed in what is becoming quite a different sort of industry. But also there's some good news. I was just in Chile at the World Copper Conference, very encouraging to hear how much progress the industry is making. Again, not enough, not fast enough, but there is progress. There's a much greater awareness of the importance of making this a win-win with communities and of bringing wider social and economic benefit. And also progress on recognising the importance of environmental protection, but not just protection, but how can this also be a nature positive agenda? And we're going to be talking later on about the very important role of technology, and also the whole recycling circular economy is another very important facet of this agenda. So it's a very complex jigsaw puzzle. I get involved in this both on the kind of diplomatic political level, very much also on a more practical level in terms of engagement with industry players, including, as was mentioned, Appian. But also I'm involved in some junior miners, so I also hear it from their point of view. And then that very important nature and community agenda too. So fundamentally, I feel we all spend a lot of time talking, but not enough time focused on practical steps. So I'm sure if any of our audience have got practical ideas, I and the other panelists will welcome them. So I'll stop there and hand over to our next speaker.
Fiona, that's great. Thank you so much. A perfect scene setter, laying out sort of many of the challenges that we are facing today. And yes, hopefully we can get into some of these practical questions during the discussion. So Tess, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. And thanks for bringing up that short presentation, which is just a couple of slides that I wanted to use to first of all, pinpoint you to the report. I think Anthony mentioned already my work done for IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization with more than 160 member states. It's headquartered in Abu Dhabi, and it works on all aspects related to the renewable energy transition, including the report for which I was the lead author, which came out in the summer of last year on the geopolitics of critical materials. You can find it on their website, and I encourage you all, of course, to read it. But for my short introductory presentation, I just wanted to focus on two key messages, which I think speak very well to the theme of this panel, which is on the theme of the securitization of mineral supply chains. So the first key message that we put forward in the report is that one of the things you often hear, and Anthony in his introductory remark already alluded to it, is the risk, the so-called risk of trading one dependency for another when we switch from fossil fuels to different low carbon energy technologies. Anthony phrased it also very well: get out of bed with Moscow and get into bed with Beijing. That's a nice way to put it. So the whole story here, of course, is that if you look at mineral supply chains, you see that China is very dominant, particularly in the midstream segment. It controls or dominates the refining and the processing of graphite, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, a host of critical minerals. So some people caution or ask the question, aren't we just sleepwalking into the future energy security disaster? Or aren't we just swapping our dependence on Russian gas to dependence on Chinese rare earths? And I think in our report, we try to qualify and nuance that perspective, because these two things are very different in many ways. But the most important way is that, of course, if your supplies of coal, oil, gas are disrupted or cut off, you have no energy. You will probably have energy price spikes, but you have an immediate impact on your energy security situation. By contrast, if the supply of cobalt, copper, rare earths, silicon, whatever is disrupted, you do not have an immediate energy security risk. You have a manufacturing risk, because these minerals and metals, they are used to build stuff, which typically has a lifespan, a technical lifespan of 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades in some cases. And so what is impacted is your ability to produce new solar panels, new batteries, new electric vehicles. But all of your existing assets, which have already been deployed, will continue to function. Obviously, your electric vehicles will not come to a halt if the supply of lithium is disrupted. So it's a totally different kind of dependence. And in one way, you could say it's more of an energy transition risk than an energy security risk. And there are many more differences. Obviously, minerals, just like fossil fuels, need to be mined, but they need to be mined only once, because they can be brought into circular pathways. They can be recycled, reused. There are also many more opportunities to substitute them compared to, for instance, oil, which has long been the dominant fuel for transportation. We will probably need less mining, not more. If you look at the sheer quantity of minerals that we are extracting now, we are extracting about 10 million tons of critical energy transition minerals each year. This will rise to perhaps 70 million tons by 2050, but that pales in comparison to the 15 billion, not million tons of fossil fuels that we need to extract every year just to keep our energy system going. So there's going to be a lot of mining that is needed, but in general, we're going to dig less stuff out of the ground compared to the fossil fuel system. And then finally, mineral markets are also many orders of magnitude smaller than fossil fuel markets. So it's highly unlikely that minerals will ever generate as much rent as fossil fuels do today, especially oil. Next slide, please. So the second point is that, having said all that, I don't want to minimize any of the geopolitical supply risks that exist, and especially the concentration of mineral supply chains in the upstream sector, in the midstream sector is something that probably should be mitigated. So yes, there are real geopolitical supply risks, but some are more likely than others. And no country can insulate itself from these geopolitical supply risks. Even China. China is the world's largest processor of many minerals, but it's also the world's biggest importer of raw lithium, raw nickel, a host of raw materials itself. So China is also very worried about geopolitical supply risks. It's not just we in Europe or the Americans that are worried about it. This is a feature that is shared by many countries in the world. We often talk about a supply chain, but I think it would be more accurate to use the metaphor of a web. Countries are entangled in a web, not in a chain, if you look at all of these different geographies of these different minerals. And so in the report, we identified a couple of geopolitical supply risks, and some of them were more prevalent and more acute, like export restrictions, which have been on the rise for years. We see also recently that China has put in place some export restrictions on gallium, germanium, and other minerals, but it's not the only country doing that. Other risks are deemed less acute at the moment. Mineral cartels. There has been a lot of talk about creating a lithium cartel, for instance, in Latin America, but the chances are very low at the moment that this will materialize, because the lithium sector has not been brought under the control of a national lithium company in many of these countries. And the biggest lithium extractor producer, Australia, is never going to join this effort. So some of these risks are very real, others are perhaps less acute at the moment, but there are real geopolitical risks. And I'll stop here for now and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, really important framing again for us in terms of the discussion, and yeah, particularly like the chart at the end with the 6 different geopolitical risks that we can come back to. So now, Sebastian, in terms of some of the maybe the environmental and social issues around the energy transition and critical materials, would be great to hear from you.
Yes, thank you so much, Anthony, and thanks to Fiona and Tess. That's been fantastic so far. It's already been a very exciting discussion for me. So I apologize if this comes across a bit disjointed, but I've tried to shoehorn in some points already from what other panelists have said. So I guess now for something completely different, as Anthony says, I come at this from the environmental and social science side. My involvement is largely through a project we have at the moment with the UN Environment Programme in Paris, their economy division. Laying out the social and environmental costs of the energy transition and what we can do to mitigate that. So I'm going to start with what I hope will be something that stimulates discussion. And we already heard Fiona discuss environmental safeguards and their kind of relation to the project life cycle and the timings of that. So I would say that I'll put across that I believe there's nothing in environmental and social safeguards that delay the energy transition. I think there's been lots of high-profile cases recently where I think the blame has been unfairly put on the doorstep of environmental and social safeguards. But I would say I was at a panel recently, I think earlier maybe last year, Financial Times Energy Transition Conference, where there was a multitude of renewable energy companies on the panel, and every one of them said that it's actually supply chain issues that are causing delays in their kind of rollout, and nothing to do with the environmental permits. So I just wanted to put that out there as a kind of potential fire starter for later conversations. And I wanted to go through 3 things that for me would underpin a socially and ecologically just energy transition. And the first is environmental considerations. So we heard Fiona talk a lot about disconnect, which I think is a fantastic kind of word to use for this. And traditionally there's been quite a disconnect in kind of energy infrastructure and the environmental risks associated with that. So I think the first step is making sure that we understand the risks and dependencies of our energy infrastructure as much as possible, or continuing to understand. The first of which is biodiversity loss. So I'm very biased in that WCMC is a centre of biodiversity science. So we work quite a lot on that. There are a lot of mining sites that are in areas of high biodiversity value, and it's highly dependent on how we do this energy transition as to whether they continue to operate or whether they continue to operate in more remote locations. The second environmental risk is a kind of, UNEP talks about the triple planetary crisis. So not only is it the ecological crisis, but it's also the climate crisis and pollution crisis. The climate and pollution we can't afford to ignore when we come for kind of the energy transition and the critical minerals associated with it. And the third one on that kind of first point is life cycle assessment. So I actually just came to this meeting from a roundtable of renewable energy companies, and I would say that they are much more advanced already in life cycle assessment than kind of previous industries were. So we work with other sectors, and it's been a very short period of time that they've had to get to grips with proper life cycle assessment, and I think they're doing quite a good job. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the just transition and kind of development issues globally. So the first of which, I think, I don't think anyone would disagree that the mining sector historically has not developed the best reputation for itself in terms of its social safeguards. It's got much better recently, but it has had that kind of history that's associated with it. So there's a chance here to really kind of get rid of that and kind of rid those skeletons in terms of involving communities and bringing them along with us on this transition. I think one of the other panelists talks about skills development. I think there's I would say a real lack of excitement when talking about the energy transition, because I mean, for me, we talk about this kind of, say, the Inflation Reduction Act in America. There's this, need for a kind of post-war construction that it would be all-encompassing. And I think, if people only knew the kind of scale that we needed, they'd know that there were kind of jobs for life in this sector. So I kind of try and talk with as much excitement about that as possible. Global collaboration is needed for the just transition. So we work closely with colleagues on the resolution from the United Nations Environment Assembly, which attempts to get at closer collaboration between countries on environmental technologies that lead to kind of minimizing the impacts of mines and their supply chains. And that's, the proof will be in the pudding for that, the implementation of that resolution. The third thing, just quickly, is circular economy considerations. So our report lays out quite a few of the Rs. So there's 8 Rs. Most of them you would probably guess: kind of reduce, rethink, replace. All of these things are what we currently need to implement as fast as possible to reduce the demand as much as possible. So I think Fiona and Tess were talking that the counterfactual here is important to get right. And even if we did none of this rethinking, we have enough materials to implement the energy transition. It just helps a lot if we manage to reduce the demand side as much as possible. So I'll finish there. I don't want to take up too much of the question and answer times, but I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I'm really glad that you picked up on the point about the circular economy, which I think is an area that we should come back to. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's a couple of points that I'd like to pick up on, and I just was checking back my notes. I'm hoping I'm quoting the right figure from you, Fiona, in terms of, you said there were 35 critical material strategies. Oh no, sorry, 35 critical material countries, including copper. No, I'm missing the. How many countries was it?
Oh, yeah. So well, that's if you're counting the EU as one country. And I suspect that figure is now out of date. Anyway.
But anyway, we're talking in that order.
Yeah.
So large numbers of countries have developed these strategies, and I just wondered if people if they know about these strategies from their individual areas of expertise, what are the best ones of those in some ways, and what are the worst examples? Can we see where countries are getting it right in terms of these strategies, and also where they're getting it wrong?
Well, I think so. In fact, I think it was in Thesis' excellent IRENA report. There's a very useful table of energy transition materials defined as critical by countries and regions, and so that is where I've got the 35 lists from. And I think there's over 50 materials covered on that. And so, first of all, it's very interesting to see the different variation between countries as to what they think is critical or not. Some of that reflects their own domestic production. Some of it reflects, obviously, their particular industry priorities and perhaps perceptions of ease of sourcing. For example, cobalt, which is something I have personal interest in from the Chilean Cobalt Corporation, that is on 29 out of 35 lists. But actually, that's something where the market at the moment is rock bottom because of change in lithium battery chemistry. It's perceived that will just solve the cobalt supply. It won't. And there are all sorts of geopolitical dimensions to that, human rights issues, because 70% of cobalt comes from the DRC and in turn is processed in China. So that's just one illustration of how complicated this picture is. So again, my expert colleagues can comment far better than I can, but I feel you've almost had this race to produce a strategy, strongly driven by the US, their very innovative approach with the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course isn't just about critical minerals. It's fundamentally about how America moves in terms of clean technology, also healthcare, etc., how that brings economic benefit. And therefore, there are all sorts of tax and subsidy benefits going along with that. You then had the EU come along with the Critical Raw Materials Act, quite similar in overall intent, structured in a slightly different way. And then you have the individual countries, such not least the UK, Australia, Canada, India, Japan, etc. And I think overall, you've then got wider policies and regulations. And I think the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has identified there's over 200 policies and regulations across the world that relate to trade and investment, as well as the direct supply chains. But so first of all, we've got huge complexity. But then, in my view, it's everyone's charged ahead with producing a strategy as though that actually solves the problem. And there's lots of aspirational talk in the various strategies about developing partnerships and alliances. But so far, we've seen little hard evidence of that really moving in a major way. Obviously, individual deals are being done. There's a lot of diplomacy being done. There's a lot of international visits and meetings. But in terms of real concrete alliances that move the dial, that, in my view, is at a very nascent stage. But I'll stop there and hand over to others.
No, that's great, because raising the point about the complexity and the diversity of issues that are important for the different materials and the different geographies. But Tess, if I could come to you in terms of a bit of a comment on that, but then also maybe Fiona's point about the lack of partnerships, or the partnerships not delivering. I mean, we see that, again, G20, G7, US, EU, all of which are sort of launching or being engaged with different degrees of cooperation on the international level, governmental level. Are these effective? How might these go forward? So maybe those two questions over for you, if that was possible.
Sure. And I think in terms of just listing critical raw materials, which most major economies are doing, I think that's a no regret strategy, because you have to monitor the market. You have to monitor what is being, which markets are becoming tight, what are your needs. So most major economies have had critical material lists for decades, because we must not forget that these minerals are not just needed for energy transition purposes, but also for defense, for technology, for many other sectors as well. And mostly for defense purposes. That's why many countries, including the US, have had critical material lists for decades already. It's just now that we're adding a layer on top of that, because we're becoming aware that we also need those things for energy technologies, and that we're looking at it from this picture. So I think that's a no regrets issue. There's some difference in how criticality is defined. Usually it's a mixture of supply risk and economic importance, but it's, as you say, different for each country, and it changes over time. The EU has had, I think, 4 or 5 or 6 critical material lists. They have tended to expand over time, but these things shift over time, dependent also on technology shifts that may occur. Now, in terms of alliances and strategies, I think the European approach is a bit different from the US approach. In the Critical Raw Materials Act, the US sets itself a target, which is non-binding, by the way, to source 10% of its critical raw materials from domestic extraction by 2030. I'm not sure we will be able to make it, because, as Fiona has said before, that there are very long lead times in developing new mines. Some of them might take off quicker. For instance, some types of lithium extraction, direct lithium extraction, if that technology breaks through, can happen very fast. This means that even if we meet that target by 2030, Europe will still need to import 90% of its raw materials. In the US, by contrast, if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, they have made tax credits for electric vehicles dependent on the domestic sourcing of the materials in the batteries. And that is quite something, because they have set the bar quite high. For 2023, it was 40% of the minerals needed to come either from the US itself or from countries with which the US has a free trade agreement, which is not Europe, which is not Indonesia, which is there are many countries in the world that are not included. So it's basically a strategy to move from 40% in 2023 to 80% in 2027 of the materials used in electric vehicles in the US must be sourced either from the US or from free trade partners for the vehicle to be eligible for tax credits. So it's a different kind of strategy. They try to go for friendshoring, to pick their partners based on the trade agreements they already have in place, and also to basically ramp up domestic mining to a larger extent than Europe is planning to do. And to some extent, they can do that because they have more resources than we have in Europe. But even for them, it will be quite something to basically ramp up these supply chains while at the same time carving out China. That's basically what they're trying to do. And I think, frankly speaking, that it's not possible, but that's the policy trajectory on which they are. And I think, final point, you are right. There's a lot of talk about alliances. We are in Europe making hydrogen agreements with some countries. We're making critical raw materials agreements with other countries. Some of them overlap. We're also on a shopping spree for LNG since the outbreak of the energy crisis. And so we're shooting in all directions. There's really a lack of a coherent strategy. In the continent, you have also the tension between various member countries with their individual priorities, and the European Commission doesn't really have the tools to steer all of this in one direction. So I think we need to think more strategically about these kinds of international partnerships and alliances. And I'll stop here.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, no, really useful clarification, at least for me, in terms of the IRA versus the EU policy in terms of, wanting to have domestic production. Sebastian, do you have thoughts in terms of environment issues or circular economy issues, either in terms of the domestic deals or domestic legislation, or in terms of the global deals? Do you think that some of these critical material clubs, etc., are putting environment and circular economies within the text? Do you think it has value, or is it just a bit of window dressing?
I won't repeat what you last said, but I would say probably the latter. I just wanted to have a quick comment on the kind of previous stuff around collaboration. And you'd be surprised to hear that with my affiliation that I don't think there's been enough partnerships at the moment. There's been a number of suggestions as to how we would solve that, including broadening the mandates of IRENA, broadening the mandates of the International Energy Agency. I think there's even been suggestions of setting up a bespoke agency around critical minerals, which could kind of foster that collaboration that's needed. Although, as Tess said, the tensions have already started to be seen because the United Nations Environment Assembly, the latest resolution, I think there was some things that were excluded from that some member states had wanted in. And there's already that kind of tension between, say, countries that would imagine that they're going to be large producers of this and those that might be more consumers. And I think just sorry, before I get on to your actual question, the last thing on this was I think it's important because there's going to be very quick winners and losers in the kind of broadest sense for this. We've already heard that cobalt prices are rock bottom, largely because of the substitutability of some of these minerals. So at one point you can be, it's important to develop these partnerships because at one point you can be riding high on your kind of mineral stocks of whatever you have. And then, this new technology comes in, it's shared through all these partnerships that have been set up in my ideal world. And they kind of proliferate, and suddenly, you've got a mineral that's not as wanted as it previously was. So you can rely on those kind of partnerships. On the environmental front, it's difficult. I think the partnerships like the European Union, it's a very population dense continent, right? So it's I think in terms of bringing up new production of mines, it's an incredibly difficult place to go. So that's where I would say leaning more heavily on the circular economy side and looking for. I really dislike the win-win phrase. I try not to use it because what we really mean is least cost, right? There is always a cost, and for that in kind of the more developed countries would be around trying to mine tailings, trying to expand the production of extant mines that have the resources, and I would tend to lean more towards that than new mines necessarily.
Great. Ludovine has put in the chat to our audience, and there's a few people on there that I know, so be warned. Yeah, can we get a few questions, please, from the audience? Otherwise, we'll carry on our conversation, and it might not go in the direction you want. So please do either put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll come on to you. I had a sort of another question which was touched upon about technology changes, and I think this is obviously it when Fiona talked about the sort of the disconnect question and about the pace of change that's necessary, is we need to be moving so fast in terms of developing the whole, I won't say supply chain, I'm going to use Theis's term of the web of supply, which I think is, much more complex. But anyway, we need to move that so fast, and we know that as you move things fast, we will get more innovation. So how is it that, or what extent do we think that technological changes will dramatically affect the extent to which we need different materials, and how does that affect the energy transition? Does that create the uncertainty, as Fiona was talking about with the batteries, is people think the lithium batteries, well, we're going to move out of those, therefore we're not investing in them, therefore in a relatively short period of time we may see a huge spike again in prices that delays things. So is this a likely scenario? Is there anything that can be done about it, given the complexities and the speed, and in some ways how young the supply chains are? In some ways they have instability. So quite a complex set of questions, but I do think at the heart of many of probably the investment choices that people are making, and how might it slow down the transition? Thijs, can I go to you first on that?
Sure, and I think it's an excellent question, because when you look at the demand projections for many of these minerals, you see that they are going to increase very rapidly across the board. And we always tend to look at mining to increase supply, but I think technological innovation to reduce demand is at least as potent as mining to increase supply. To meet anticipated demands by 2030 and beyond. And I think just one example from the EV market and the batteries for EVs is that you had a dominant technology which was based on nickel, manganese, cobalt, which had a dominant share of the market in 2019. And then you had this up-and-coming technology, LFP, lithium iron phosphate, which only had 9% of the market in 2019, but that jumped to 40% 3 years after, from 9 to 40% in a rapidly growing market. And LFP batteries contain no nickel and no cobalt. So that changes the economic fortunes also of these mineral and metal producers in particular. And there's lots of opportunities. You can substitute copper for aluminium. If copper prices go high, sometimes you already see the substitution happening, and vice versa. There was this major geopolitical incident a decade ago where allegedly China restricted rare earth exports to Japan after a naval incident, which was the rare earth crisis. But interestingly, in the late 1970s, we had a cobalt crisis because of the Angolan civil war, which then spilled over into what was then Zaire and the Katanga province, where all of these cobalt resources, most of the cobalt was mined. And so what happened then was that we had a substitution. Cobalt was used for electric motors as a dominant technology. And so many producers switched from cobalt to rare earths, solving the cobalt crisis, but sowing what would later become the rare earth crisis. And you see that after the rare earth crisis of 2010, 2013, when prices first shot up, after that they declined, they fell off a cliff. And then again, you see that part of the reason why they fell off a cliff was that the companies, firms, governments were looking for alternatives in their technologies, and a lot of substitution happened. So this is a pattern that we see in many commodity markets, and that will obviously make all of the projections out there about rising demands false. They will turn out to be false within a decade.
Before anyone else picks up, I hear what you're saying. Does that make the market more stable or less stable? Or is it just different?
Well, it's certainly different from the oil market, where you see that oil was shortly after World War II, oil eclipsed coal as the world's leading energy source, and then it was used across the board in many economies for power generation, for heating in buildings, to propel vehicles and airplanes and boats. And then after the oil shock, you see that its usage was then concentrated, especially in transportation and in petrochemicals. And a little less, or it was kicked out, at least in the OECD, out of the power sector, for instance. If you look at it in the reverse picture, transportation has been almost completely reliant on oil-based fuels for the last decades, right? So, and there was no substitute. If prices of oil went up, you had a lot of inelasticity on the demand side because people could not turn to an alternative fuel. So it's certainly different from the oil markets. And it means that if prices increase, you will see that substitution happening. And that will take some time, yes. And before, the substitution has arrived, you will have some painful years where prices are sky high. But then the substitution happens, and then probably we need to switch our gaze to the next commodity market where this same cycle will be evident again. So I think it doesn't make them more predictable. We will probably see a lot of volatility, but it's difficult because many of these markets are fairly small, especially again compared to fossil fuels, and some of them are not. They don't have global prices. For instance, a lithium contract was only introduced on the London Metal Exchange a couple of years ago. And it tries to discover the global price of lithium, but it doesn't. The lithium benchmark that they have doesn't cover all of the contracts and exchanges that are being done. So what is the global price of lithium? Basically, you cannot tell. You can tell the global price of oil, you can look at Brent, WTI, etc., but you cannot tell the global price of lithium or nickel or any other of those critical materials. Copper is a bit different because we've been trading that a lot since the 19th century already. So these markets will probably, there's a big lack of transparency, and there have been many booms and busts in the past, and I expect this pattern to continue.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really important clarifications. I really appreciate that. Fiona, do you want to go next in terms of some of the technology switching questions? But then also there's a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it from Scarlett, which is about the role of the private sector. And I think with your dual hat of the private sector and issues around sort of diplomacy and government, it would be quite a good one for you to answer. And then Seb, I'd come on to you as well, because I think it's a real one for you in terms of sustainability. So Fiona, could you address those two points? That would be great.
So I was saying I agree with the general overview that this has just given, that basically technology will help with some of the demand. It will also introduce the unexpected in terms of both the technology that comes on stream, how that changes the market, how that changes demand. However, I'm less optimistic that will in the end solve it, because I feel this is such a big paradigm shift, as I said earlier. I think we also have to bear in mind not just technology for the energy transition, but technology in mining itself. So big issues in mining are around access to water and access to power. But there are already a lot of developments in hand that are improving the whole efficiency of the mining production system and how mines operate. You have further new technologies coming on stream of remote management, AI, sensing technology, etc. You have technology that will help in surveying, in identifying future assets and resources, in ease of extraction and drilling, and also the very, very important environmental monitoring and impact side of things. So I think technology has a huge, huge role to play, and certainly kind of we don't know what that's going to be to a large extent. And I also think this is point about both volatility of the markets, but also that for many of these very specialized minerals, it's a tiny and unknown market. And that then relates to Scott's question on what is the role of finance here, particularly private finance. And Scarlett is absolutely right in the point that she's made, that you've got another disconnect, that you've got clients, as it were, who want to save the world, but then think mining is a bad thing. And so there's a huge, huge agenda here, starting with the general public, on education about mining, about understanding why mining is important, and that ultimately mining does help save the planet, and that you need to have that if we're going to move forward. But trying to get finance houses to understand that is quite difficult. And a lot of this is about building trust. So it's about shifting the narrative. It's about showing that mining actually can be nature positive, that communities can come in as partners, that it isn't all bad news. But just as an example, this morning I switched on my phone and there's an article on the BBC about a big historical problem in Brazil. And we shouldn't pretend that this hasn't happened in the past. It's about building confidence and trust for the future. And that in turn is where finance, and particularly private finance, has got a very important role to play. And it's not just about volume of money, it's about how you direct that money. So it is very much, and I'm sure Sebastian can contribute more here, it's about confidence and validity of sourcing of supply, so that investment goes to the right places for responsible and sustainable mining. It's also about how you choose where your resources are best located. And so, for example, Appian has just developed a special partnership with SAFE, which is an American organization about securing America's future energy supply. But that's looking at how you develop a methodology, how you choose where your investment is best focused. And that is not just about the quality of the asset and the security of the supply. It has to take all these wider factors into account about responsible sourcing, about environmental impacts, and ideally environmental positive measures, community involvement, etc., etc. So there's a long way to go, and I think everybody in this call is interested in this sector, and by definition can therefore help develop dialogue, spread the word about some of these issues. Back to you, Anthony.
Thank you. And just before handing over to Sebastian, is there a shortage of capital for mining? I mean, I hear what all of these things you're saying, and uncertainty from the private sector, etc. But is that a reason? Is there a shortage of capital? Is that likely to lead to a lack of these materials? I mean, I think you've all said at various stages that there are sufficient materials in order for us to do the energy transition. It's about the geopolitics, geographies, etc., etc. But is there actually a shortage of capital, or it's too expensive at the moment, the uncertainties, etc.? Do you have a sense of that? I mean, are companies waiting for more capital in order to develop projects, waiting for the international financial institutions as well as the private sector in these areas?
Yes, very, very much. So I'm afraid I haven't got the figures to hand. But the volume of money, I mean, runs into trillions that you need, both in terms actually to keep mines going as they are, as well as the expansion, as well as the sourcing new assets. And again, this acceleration to deliver, and that I'm sort of keep banging on about it, but that I feel is the thing that we're all missing, is the sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And even if there's an awareness, I'm not sure there's a very informed awareness of just what is the gap, both in terms of volume of material, in terms of time of delivery of material, and in terms of the money needed and how best to really direct that overall. And at the moment, it's very much left up to the market. And the big players are, of course, doing great deals. But as I said earlier, it's also about how you fund the junior miners, which are needed to actually meet this huge expansion in volume. But maybe this has got some more facts and figures at his fingertips.
But before that, I'm going to, Sebastian, could you come in on some of these, questions about mining and sustainability and putting off investment, and maybe some, in your experience, in terms of, you talked about it before, in terms of some of the historic problems. We can't sweep those under the carpet, or whatever the mining equivalent of that is, under the slag heap. But what is, what lessons can we learn, and how can this be done better?
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I was furiously scribbling down stuff as Fiona was talking there. I think she covered some fantastic points on it, and I think I'm quite well placed for this, specifically because I sit in UNEP WCMC in the private sector facing team. We work very closely with mining companies, working on their biodiversity mitigation strategies. I think quickly, just to tie it with your previous question, which is the technology advancements, I think that goes for environmental impact assessment as well. So I think we are constantly asked about environmental data, especially for investors, as Scarlett's asking. And actually, what I always say is the environmental data now are very, very good. Like it's no longer an excuse to say that, we don't know our risks, dependencies, and impacts because the environmental data aren't there. They are. I think that the barrier we tend to come to is actually on the company side. And I think that ties in with the next point around, how we improve that kind of historical reputation is around transparency and engagement. And I think kind of knowing where supply chains are, knowing who you're getting stuff from, I think is a big one for mining companies. I think the ones that we talk to, they'll know their kind of primary suppliers. They won't know their secondary. They certainly won't know their tertiary. And I think kind of improvements on data on that side helps to kind of really get towards the actual impact of this. And I think, I would be remiss to not be pedantic about mining being able to save the world. I think there's a lot of intersecting issues here, right? Where we could go to a future where technology has saved climate change, but hasn't saved biodiversity, right? That's easily a future where we could go to with the wrong responsible mining. So I think in answer to the question about what miners can do to be investable, is to showcase good practice, right? We work with kind of leading environmental safeguards in companies themselves, and I think just making more of that. I think we worked with ICMM on their nature position statement recently, which is all about how, as Fiona says, the mining industry wants to help. It wants to change this reputation, and a lot of that is around showing that impact. I think just to leave you on, there was a paper on ecologically responsible mining that gave a figure of in Australia, I think 5% of something like 18,000 mine sites have been in any way rehabilitated or restored. So this is something we talk about a lot, is the mitigation hierarchy, where you avoid impacts to start off. It's very, very simple stuff. You avoid impacts, you reduce the impacts as you're operating, you then rehabilitate your impacts, and then the kind of the end of it is you offset what you can't reduce in any other way. So we're not even getting past the rehabilitate state in a lot of the world. So I think starting to do that would be a good start.
Great, thank you. Got another question in the chat. And again, I encourage more people to join in. Otherwise, I'm going to start asking questions about China. So just to warn people on the chat, and if you don't want to hear more questions about China, then start firing in questions. And also, I think more discussions about some of the other materials, copper, aluminium. I've got some other things I'm really fascinated on. But maybe, firstly to the question from Chris Aylett in the chat, which is about moving up the value chain. And is this... It said, should this be considered as an early positive consequence of the energy transition in terms of Africa and some of the other developing countries and the opportunities that this might create? Sebastian, can I go to you first on that? Is that something that you've looked at, thought about?
Sure, and you're cheating here, Anthony, because we in a pre-call, Tess and I discussed this very thing. So it is a positive step. It's fantastic to support countries in developing their economies through kind of this new resource economy that we will have. It has unintended consequences a lot of the time, and I think from my perspective as a kind of an environmental expert, it's all about supporting those same countries to put in place the environmental safeguards to make sure that it doesn't come at a cost to the environment. So Tess and I in the previous call discussed nickel, which is a very, very classic one of Indonesia wanting to move up that value chain. It's also one where production quantities of nickel have been very, very rigorously shown to tightly couple with deforestation in Indonesia. So it's one of those ones where it's a very classic case of it's fantastic for social development to have that economy that's increasing, but at the same time, we have to do it with the environmental and social safeguards in place. So it's about supporting those countries to do so.
Tess, do you want to come in next on that?
Sure. I think the Indonesian example is really something that is important. I think Indonesia is being looked at by other developing countries as a trailblazer because they've had that ban on the exports of unprocessed nickel in place since 2014, and there was a brief pause between 2016 and 2020, but then they reinstated it. And I think by 2019 they had 2 nickel smelters, and now they have more than a dozen. So from their viewpoint, this is an absolute success because they get much more revenue from the export of processed nickel than they get from the export of raw nickel. From the viewpoint of us in Europe, let's say, I think there are exactly 2 downsides. One is that, as Sebastian hinted at, these nickel smelters also have a very bad environmental footprint, particularly because of the acid leaching technology that many of them use. But secondly, also in terms of geopolitics, many of the foreign investments in nickel smelters in Indonesia have been done by China. The overwhelming majority of nickel smelters in Indonesia are Chinese companies that are building nickel smelters in Indonesia. And I think this is a missed opportunity for Europe because if European investors would have stepped in, maybe they would have had different environmental, social standards while they were implementing it. They could also sell it to the Indonesian government. And I think we should try to do it in other countries because whichever way you look at it, there is a race going on between the big economic powers of today, China, the US, Europe. And I think Europe's unique selling proposition to gain access to, for instance, some African or Latin American mineral and metal producers is to say, well, we come in, but we're not just going to take the resource out. We're going to have you take part in the value chain and accrue a much larger share of the wealth. And we're going to implement European standards, labor standards, environmental standards, and so forth. And I think this is something that is this is a win-win-win, if you want, Sebastian. It's good for our diversification. It's good for development and it's good for climate change because many of these mineral-rich countries also have more renewable potential than Europe does. We're quite constrained in terms of the amount of electricity that we can devote to processing and refining, which is a very energy-intensive industry. And we see that many of the zinc smelters and heavy metal processing facilities in Europe are now in distress because of years of high electricity prices. So from that viewpoint as well, it would make a lot of sense for Europe to really make this our unique selling proposition towards those mineral economies.
You mentioned that at the end. I was doing my little prep for the call, and I read a figure which says it came from the mining industry in Europe, so one has to be aware where it comes from. But they said 50% of Europe's aluminium, zinc, and silicon capacity was taken offline by the energy crisis in Ukraine. I mean, that is huge in terms of a very short period of time, a very quick transition that, I guess speaks to that point about is the production going to take place in other places. But just one point on that. I mean, conversations that we've had is, I mean, things like in DRC, as I understand it, China is not only extracting raw materials, it is allowing or is enabling the countries to go up the value chain. The idea about building battery cassette facilities there. So it's not just the EU that's saying we want to help you in this direction. I think China and others are also doing it. So I guess it is a bit of a question is, how can we work together to enable going up the value chain and maintain environmental standards and be competitive? And that's the challenge that I guess all of these facilities face. There's been a few more questions in the chat. I don't know if you are also following it here. There was a one from David, which I think we sort of covered a bit, but it may be worth having a look at that in terms of how mining companies and offices in Africa slow to adopt solar and battery technologies. What suggestions the panelists have to encourage mining companies to accelerate the energy transition? And I think a bit that speaks to that point is how do we enable that to happen when we are in global competitions, potentially with countries that may not have the same desires, but yet maybe therefore become more attractive for the host countries, or may not. I mean, it's something that we have to work through. So yeah, Sebastian, when you look, I was hoping that little movement was, I want to come in on that, but if not, then hope I haven't landed you. And then Fiona, if you've got thoughts as well.
It was actually the opposite, actually. So
Oh.
if you have something to contribute immediately, please go ahead. Otherwise, I can come up.
Well, if I talk in more general terms, and Africa's been highlighted in the chat, I think, a couple of times. And always, and of course that's my experience, but Latin America is really important. And so, first of all, my general observation on the international stage is Africa, for all its problems, all its tensions between individual countries, is actually pretty good at raising its profile on this critical minerals agenda, whereas Latin America as a region is fairly silent. Individual countries sometimes speak out, but in my view, not enough. And this shouldn't really be competition between both regions, although obviously to some extent it is. But there's lots of parallels where they could actually help one another, because those two regions in the world, historically long neglected by Western powers, actually have much of what the world needs. So at the moment, I think over half of the world's mining production is covered by China, US, Russia, Australia. Europe's got about 7% of production, and Latin America and Africa just over 5% each. But in the long term, Latin America and Africa hold vast unexplored reserves, and particularly of those critical minerals needed for the energy transition. So first of all, they're pretty important. Secondly, these partnerships and alliances we're talking about, in my view, need to be reframed a little. That this shouldn't just be essentially about asset stripping, about Western powers identifying what critical minerals they need, who's got them, and therefore will go and sign an agreement. It needs to be done in a way that is a real partnership that brings the social and economic benefits. In terms of the question about mining companies, for example, in Africa that have been slow to adopt some of those energy storage projects, ultimately this is about economics. And that if you can show companies that actually it's cheaper, that they get a competitive advantage by adopting these new technologies as part of their overall production and processes, then they'll do it. And that can be driven also by investors and investor choice and influence. So that's some general thoughts on that. But I'll hand back to you and the others, Anthony.
Thank you. Sebastian, I'm going to come to you, but maybe also I don't know if you saw Annabelle's question. Just in terms of some of the questions in terms of education and engagement and information, which I think, Fiona, you highlighted the need for. I don't know if we can, Fiona, at the very beginning, you talked about we need to get specific. We need to be making If you could mull that over and then come back after I've done Sebastian, then that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I think you're going to hit a number of really great points there in terms of I'm going to have to say it's win-wins for regions working with each other, where there's that real kind of suggestion of energy access and developing renewable energy technologies. So there is a win for both regions in the sense of kind of developing those technologies as well as really addressing energy access, which for those regions is much more the concern. I think on Annabelle's question, it depends at what scale you're looking at in terms of the engagement and the education around this. So for us, from a biodiversity perspective, there's been a lot of kind of regulatory frameworks that are kind of forcing the issue around transparency and making it much easier for you to know the impacts of certain companies and how they are handling them. And that's directed from things like the TNFD, so the Task Force for Nature Financial Related Disclosures. I have to say really quickly because I don't really like acronyms, but yes, TNFD closely followed the Carbon One TCFD, and that's enshrined for us in the global biodiversity framework, where Target 15 of that is around supporting countries to develop transparency frameworks for corporates around their risks, impacts, and dependencies on nature. So that's the kind of top level. That for me makes it easier to educate yourself on kind of the impacts of companies. And then at the very, very other end of the scale, local engagement. I mean, I think, yeah, that's a tricky one. That's all about getting the social license to operate. And operates on a kind of contextual basis, so it's very much dependent on where the operation is in terms of how best to educate people around the effects of the site and the benefits to the local community.
Great, thank you. Fiona, did you have anything else to add in terms of specifics?
Well, I think first of all, the ICMM is doing some great work in this area. So the ICMM, the International Council on Metals and Minerals, that's the collective. I think it's about top 30 companies, but also in turn that influences the trade associations and junior mining sector. And they are doing a lot of work on public engagement and how you shift that narrative, and very much helping people understand that mining is just fundamental to our everyday life and the world we live in, as well as all the about saving the planet and climate change. But there's an awful long way to go. And also, how many of us have ever talked about mining just in a general conversation with family or friends or with someone on the bus or whatever? Probably not at all. Okay. But something that's so fundamental to our lives, perhaps we should. So education has got to be at all levels. Including starting in schools, obviously, and then building its way up, but being part of everyday life. I mean, I've even suggested that there should be a kind of just general TV drama series with a mining theme to just familiarize people with that world. So I think there's lots of things that can be done just in terms of basic understanding. I really think attracting a new generation and a wider generation of skills talent is really important. And getting students in all disciplines to think about how's this work relevant to the world of mining, and perhaps there's a future for me in that. It isn't just about being a mining engineer, important though that is, or a geologist. And then it's also about helping companies. And so another side of this is, on the one hand, it's great all these standards are being developed, but it's pretty complicated if you're a company, particularly a junior company, trying to find your way through. Again, the ICMM and others are trying to do work to standardize the standards. But again, very complicated and a long, long way to go.
Right, thank you. I was going to say we've got 10 minutes. I'm absolutely going to finish on time, if not slightly before, because we were having a conversation before about the problem with Zoom calls and going back to back, and other people have got to jump on new calls. So we're going to try and finish a few minutes before at least. So I mentioned before that AIG are our kind sponsors. So we have a question from AIG that I would like our panel to look at. And then I have one final question, but yeah, Fiona, maybe Jess Armstrong is on the call and he could pick up and do a succession series on mining rather than the media. So anyway, we can try and follow that up. But so Augustine here says, what role should insurance companies be playing in both the securitization and transition of energy materials, aside from providing investment capital? So maybe you can have a little your final thoughts on that. And then my final question that I would like to throw out there, which is was a bit to come back to China again, because in some ways, when I started the initial thing, it's about getting out of bed with Moscow and getting into bed with Beijing. How serious, I mean, in terms of what I've taken from the conversation is the complexities of these things, the timescales, the urgency, etc. So how do we change that narrative that there is that overarching concern? Is that a serious threat? Because it seems to be the driver of many policies. If it is a serious threat, are the policies addressing it? And if it's not a serious threat, then how can we try to change that narrative? So a bit of a minute or so each, both in terms of the role of insurance companies and how do we address China within the framework of our approaches to critical materials. So who wants to go first? Tess, do you want to go first? Kick off.
Sure, but I'll skip the insurance question, I
Okay.
guess, because that's not really my specialty. But on China, I think if I remember correctly, the Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union specifies that no single supplier should account for a share of more than 65% of supply of a specific mineral by 2030. I think that is a laudable goal. It's still a high share, 65%. But for some of these minerals and metals, you have a lot of concentration, not just at the country level, but even at the mine level. So, for instance, there is this single rare earth mine in northwestern China, the Bayan Obi mine, which has 70% of rare earth deposits reserves in the world. And it produces about 50% of rare earths elements in the world. So it's really difficult to circumvent China there. So you need to be a bit realistic and down to earth in terms of how far you can go. And as I said before, if you want to have 10% of your minerals by 2030 coming from domestic extraction, then 90% still needs to be imported. So there's no way around for the European countries to just keep the dialogue with China and keep doing business with China. And there is this, in Washington, there's a lot of talk about decoupling. Now they're talking about de-risking. The European policymakers have sort of also adopted the same term. Nobody really knows what it means. We need to do something about our overdependence on a single country, but what it exactly is, nobody knows. But I think that there is a risk that, in Washington, that there's this really China bashing sentiment, and I think it would be wrong for Europe to follow it blindly, because it would hurt our own interests, if only for that matter. And what we see is, for instance, in the last couple of months, China has put in place export restrictions on a slate of minerals. Gallium, germanium, rare earth processing technologies, graphite as well. These are not export curbs. These are export restrictions, which most often mean that the companies wanting to export these minerals need to get a license from the government in Beijing. So that means that the government in Beijing can basically control the supply, but they are not curbing the supply as of yet. But each of these steps that China is taking is a response to Western sanctions that they are putting in place, like, for instance, prohibiting export of sensitive technologies relating to chips technologies, which is something that Dutch companies are now also doing under impulse of US pressure. And so there's this tit for tat logic. There's basically already an economic Cold War going on, and there's this talk about technological decoupling that is already going on. And I think it's dangerous, because we are in no position to decouple ourselves from China in at least a decade, if not more. There was last year a big rare earth discovery in, I think it was Norway or Sweden, But, to get these rare earths out of the ground, it will take at least a decade, if not more. So you have to be very realistic. Europe has one rare earth processing facility. It's in Estonia. It's a remnant of the Soviet era. We have, at the moment, I think, one functioning nickel smelter. We have one lithium refinery, a very small chemicals company outside of London. That's where we are at. So even in terms of processing, with high electricity prices still in Europe compared to other jurisdictions, we are in no position right now to decouple ourselves from China. So we need to find a way to keep the dialogue, engage with China, and make sure that they are also trying to ramp up their environmental standards, because there's a lot of potential resentment among the local population. Rare earth processing facilities are also a very dirty business that create radioactive waste, etc. We should be grateful that China has picked up this industry for us the last 30 years, while we in the West were very happy to see it leave. So yeah, I think there's no way around keeping the dialogue afloat.
Great, thank you. Sebastian, do you have any final thoughts in a minute or so?
Yeah,
I don't know if you could do anything on the insurance company question or not.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, I think for me, it's kind of collaborating with NGOs on data sharing and ensuring that transparency for investments. That's again, I'm not an insurance expert as well, but when we work with insurance companies, that's where it's around standard settings. I guess I just really quickly agree with a lot of what Tess said there. Decoupling myself from the security concerns and the geopolitics, which I'm not an expert in, I get a bit annoyed at the vilification of China in the sense that what from an environmentalist perspective, what they've really done is did what we were trying to get people to do 30 years ago, and now we're in the situation where there's this urgency because we didn't do it. They have all the processing now, and it's just getting stuck in and doing it. I think there's no more excuses.
Thank you. Fiona.
Well, I think the other two speakers have identified the key points, and this in turn, I'm no expert on insurance either, but all these things, the role of insurance, the issue of China, its dominance, etc., the disconnects that I talked about earlier in all their different aspects, all this needs dialogue. So we need to understand more about what role the insurance companies can play. We need their expertise. We need their ability to see the world and risks in different ways. That could be a very, very valuable contribution in the whole field. And I'm not aware of those discussions happening at the moment. On China, I feel the West actually has a very protectionist approach, and we might not like China's domination on both production and processing, but it is a reality. But this might be a very controversial view. I've yet to be convinced that the right approach is simply to try and cut them out or ignore them. I don't think that's realistic. So also, I've yet to really go to a meeting that has China involved in it in open and constructive way. Now, for all sorts of wider geopolitical reasons, there's a real breakdown of trust on over many issues. But to me, this is about our world of the future, and we're in this world together. So actually having some dialogue on all these things is really important.
Great. Well, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks again for AIG for sponsoring the event. I was going to do a little summary, but I promised everyone that we could leave on time, and I'm a bit torn. So I would, obviously what we've touched upon is the complexities and the urgency and the disconnects and the need to include environmental considerations and whole cycles of the technologies. And I guess, finishing up on China is really, really important. I think we all accept the reality of we will remain dependent on them for some period of time, and how best to manage that dependency is key. And most of that, or that will be enhanced in terms of greater discussion and engagement. So let's hope that we can continue those discussions. So thanks very much indeed for our three panelists. Really, really useful discussion, really informative. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And please do come along, for those in London, in person on the 16th, have some lunch with us, have a discussion, and we'll be discussing the future of fossil fuels. So have a good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thanks very much. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.